Ernest with you in the fight back. Let's talk about Ernest Mandel. Ernest Mandel, if you didn't know, was probably the most important Trotskyist leader in the aftermath of World War II. He was the leader for many decades of the United Secretariat of the Fourth International. And The Meaning of the Second World War is one of his most important books. Mandel is primarily known as an economist, and he's written other works such as Marxist Economic Theory and an Introduction to Marxist Economics, both of which I recommend you read. Now, Mandel sometimes gets a lot of slack for being a rather doctrinaire thinker and for being soft on Stalinism. But in The Meaning of the Second World War, Mandel is exploring the World War II. And I'm going to say right now, whatever criticisms that people have of Mandel, of his orthodox Trotskyism, of perhaps his overly optimistic view of revolution, Mandel, as a person, I believe, deserves commemoration for his actions during the war. Mandel was a member of a small Trotskyist resistance cell in Belgium. He was captured twice by the Nazis. Once he managed to escape on his own. The second time, he actually convinced his jailer, on the basis of class solidarity, to let him go, which actually worked. Unfortunately for Mandel, he was later recaptured by the Nazis and spent the remainder of the war in a Nazi concentration camp. Now, on the basis of that alone, I think Mendel's worth listening to because he was someone involved in this. And too often when Marxists talk about World War II, we get a few views. One is it was a noble struggle against fascism. And that may be true from certain points of view, but we also have the fact that we're talking about colonial empires like Britain, France, and the United States, that on the one hand were fighting fascism, but at the same time were treating their colonial subjects in ways that were very similar to how the fascists treated their subjects. And on the other hand, we have those who, because the war was fought largely between imperialist powers such as the United States versus Germany or the United States versus Japan, it's very easy for Marxists to say we don't support the war. Mandel is looking at the war in a much more nuanced picture, and he divides the war into 5 parts. One of which is there's an inter-imperialist war, which he traces to the aftermath of World War I and the fact that imperialism generates wars, and he looks at how this came about, and he does it in a really good, detailed way. This book is mostly a broad outline, but he does give you the basic contours of what led to World War II. You know, we have the Versailles Treaty, the rise of Nazism, Japanese militarism, and all that. And he says, basically the inter-imperialist war, Nazi Italy, Japan versus the United States, France, and England on the other hand. And for a political point of view, he says Marx is in a war between imperialist powers, we were totally against it. On the second hand, we have World War II as a self-defense by the people of China, which was an oppressed semi-colonial country against Japanese imperialism. And he's saying and he goes into about the details of the Japanese occupation of China and the Chinese resistance. And he's saying even though the Chinese had to make common cause with the United States imperialism, the war was still a war of national liberation, and Marxists should be clear-cut on where they stand, which is with the Chinese people. 3 is there's a war of defense by the Soviet Union against Nazi Germany. That's pretty clear-cut. The war the Nazis launched against the Soviet Union was incredibly blood-soaked and brutal, resulting in the deaths of upwards of 30 million people in the Soviet Union. And Mandel is quite clear, even though he's opposed very wholeheartedly to the Stalinist leadership, he says we were for the absolute victory of the Soviet people against the murderous robbers of German imperialism. Pretty straightforward to me. 4, and I personally think you don't have to really separate this from 2, is there's a just war of national liberation of the oppressed colonial peoples of Africa and Asia. against British and French imperialism, sometimes Japanese imperialism, sometimes the United States. He's saying they're justified. Doesn't matter who it's against. For instance, Ho Chi Minh was opposed to French imperialism. The Japanese come in, keeps on fighting. The Japanese leave, keep on fighting. And I think we could pretty much probably put China in there. I don't know why he separates them. But he gives the basic contours of this as well. And fifth is, he says the most complex is, when Europe was occupied by Nazi imperialism, there was the tendency in at least, and he names 5 countries at least, Yugoslavia, Greece, Poland, France, and Italy, and he says there was a war of liberation by workers, peasants, and the urban petty bourgeoisie against Nazi imperialism. And he's saying Marxists support this. Now, it can be argued to what extent Yugoslavia or Greece were really on the cusp of the socialist revolution. Yugoslavia certainly, but there's the question of how much was that really a revolution from below after the war. Greece, of course, had its civil war. Poland, we also have the fact that it was occupied by the Soviet Union, and France and Italy. How close could the communists there have come to power? It's really difficult to say. Certainly, they were strong forces. And he's saying, regardless of sometimes these mass resistance were in the hands of bourgeois nationalists, Stalinists, or social democrats, but revolutionaries can't abstain. You got to be out there in the forefront. And he's saying, yeah, sometimes these struggles, whether in France, Italy, or wherever, were often maybe appeals to nationalism and patriotism. But the fact is, the Nazis were pretty brutal in their occupation. And Mandel, throughout his work, does an excellent job of laying out the strategies of the various powers. He lays out the resources at command, the social forces involved. I really think it's a basic contour. In a sense, he kind of lays to rest the whole idea of a good war. And he really shows that the World War II was not just this clear-cut good and evil. There's a lot going on there, and I like how he breaks it down into 5 wars. And he even goes back to World War I, and this is an amendum. And he's saying World War I was not just the various imperialist powers fighting each other. He's saying also that we have, generated from World War I, we have wars of national liberation, notably Ireland in 1916. And towards the tail end of World War I, wars of either civil wars, socialist revolution in Russia, Germany, and elsewhere. Now, I think this is a really good book because it really gives you probably one of the better Marxist analysis of World War II. That isn't, and Mandel is no Soviet apologist, and he's really taken an overall look. And you can argue that he should have gone into more detail in various points. That's fine. But I really think he lays it out there. The problem I do see, and this goes to point 1 about the inter-imperialist war, is for those of us who have been activists, how should workers and revolutionaries have responded in the United States? Should we have obstructed aid to the Soviet Union even though it was coming from the United States? Should workers have agitated, engaged in sabotage? These are difficult questions, not easily answered. And I'm certain Mandel has written on this, and I know Trotsky has, but he, it's not merely an academic question. How should Marxists respond in a situation like that? And it's an interesting question that should be debated. But Ernest Mandel is a personal hero of mine just because of his personal example, and I've always enjoyed his writings. I recommend Meaning of the Second World War, which is being re-released by Verso Books, so please check it out. This is Enaa in with you in the fight back. Until next time.